The floor of the Grand Hall trembled before the ship even landed. Daniel Voss felt it through the soles of his boots, a low hum that climbed up his legs and settled in his chest like a second heartbeat. He had felt tremors like this before, in places far from here, in years he tried not to remember. But nothing in his old life had prepared him for what was descending toward Vera Station now. The alarms had gone silent an hour ago, not because the danger had passed, but because someone far above his pay grade had ordered them switched off. Panic, the station director said, was worse than the truth. Daniel was not so sure the truth was any better. He stood near the observation window with 2 other guards, watching a shape grow larger against the black. It was not a warship in the way he understood warships. It had no visible weapons, no plating scarred by battle. It was smooth and pale gold, curved like something grown rather than built, and it moved without sound. That silence frightened him more than an engine roar ever could. "That's her," muttered Grace Bennett beside him, adjusting the strap of her sidearm out of habit rather than need. She was younger than Daniel, sharp-eyed, the kind of person who noticed everything and said little. The Empress herself. Not a governor, not a fleet commander. Her. "You sound certain," Daniel said. "I read the transmission before they cut the feed. Ithara Sel, ruler of the Kryzeth Empire. She doesn't usually come to places like this." Daniel looked out at the golden shape, now close enough that its size became clear. It was larger than the entire station. He thought of every story he had heard about the Kryzeth since they first made contact with human space 8 years ago. Some said they were fair rulers, offering protection in exchange for loyalty. Others said their empire was built on the bones of 100 worlds that had once believed the same thing. He had joined the security contract on Vera Station because it was steady work, far from anything that resembled a battlefield. He had left the military 3 years ago, tired of following orders that cost lives he could not save. He wanted quiet. He wanted distance. Instead, distance had come looking for him. The ship settled into the station's largest dock with a gentleness that felt almost insulting, as if it barely noticed the effort. Within minutes, Station Command relayed new orders through every channel at once. All personnel were to assemble in the Grand Concourse. All weapons were to be surrendered to Kryzeth Escort. All human administrators were, effective immediately, subordinate to the visiting authority. Daniel felt the words land like something physical. Subordinate. Not partners. Not hosts. Subordinate. "They didn't even ask," Grace said quietly. "They never do," Daniel replied. By the time he reached the concourse, it was already full. Hundreds of station workers stood in uneven rows, some in uniform, some pulled straight from their shifts, all of them silent, in a way that felt unnatural for a crowd that size. At the front of the room, a line of tall figures in pale ceremonial armor stood at perfect attention. Their skin held a faint silver sheen, and their eyes were a shade of violet that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. These were Kryzeth soldiers, the first Daniel had seen in person rather than on a screen. Between them walked a figure who needed no introduction. Empress Ithara Sel moved without hurry, as though the room existed simply to be walked through. Her robes were a deep shade of blue-black, embroidered with patterns that seemed to shift faintly when she moved, catching light no one else could see. She was tall, taller than any Kryzeth soldier flanking her, and she carried herself with the kind of stillness that came only from never once needing to prove her authority. When she reached the center of the concourse, every human in the room dropped to one knee. It happened almost instantly, like a wave breaking, hundreds of bodies folding downward at once. Daniel felt Grace go down beside him. He felt the guard on his other side follow. He did not move. He was not trying to make a statement. In that first moment, it was almost an accident, a half-second of disbelief that froze his legs in place, while his mind tried to process the speed of what was happening around him. But that half-second stretched. He looked at the sea of bowed heads, at people he had worked beside for 3 years, people who had never bowed to anyone in their lives, folding themselves down because they were afraid not to. And something in him refused to follow. It was not defiance exactly. It was older than that, something that had been part of him long before Vera Station, long before the military, something that had been shaped the day he swore an oath to protect people, rather than obey power for its own sake. Kneeling to a threat was one thing. He had done that before, tactically, when survival required it. But this was not a threat pointing a weapon at him. This was a room full of people folding themselves smaller, out of pure reflexive fear, and Daniel found he could not add his body to that picture. He stood among the guards near the outer wall, upright, his hands loose at his sides, and waited to see what would happen next. It took a moment for anyone to notice him. The Empress's gaze moved across the kneeling crowd the way a wind moves across a field, marking the shape of things without lingering. Then it stopped. Daniel felt the shift in the room before he understood its cause. Whispers rippled outward from those closest to him, low and urgent. Grace, still kneeling, turned her head just enough to look up at him with wide eyes that said more clearly than words, "What are you doing?" He did not have an answer for her. Not yet. The Empress's violet eyes settled on him fully, and for the first time since the ship had appeared in the sky, the Golden Hall fell completely silent. Even the soldiers seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see how their ruler would respond to the single figure who had not bowed. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her words carried across the concourse with an ease that suggested the room itself had been built to serve her acoustics. "You," she said, and though it was a single word, it filled every corner of the hall. "Stand forward." Daniel felt every eye in the room turn toward him. He felt Grace's hand brush his ankle, a silent plea to reconsider, to bow now while there was still a chance. He did not look down at her. He kept his eyes on the Empress and stepped forward, out of the line of guards, into the open space between the kneeling crowd and the golden-armored soldiers. His footsteps were the only sound in the hall. He stopped a respectful distance from her, close enough to show he was not hiding, far enough to remain within what his training told him was a defensible position, though he doubted that mattered here. Up close, she was even more striking than she had seemed from across the room. Her expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between curiosity and something colder, something that had not decided yet whether to be amused or offended. "You did not kneel," she said. It was not a question. "No," Daniel answered. His voice came out steadier than he expected. "I didn't." A murmur ran through the crowd, quickly silenced by the sharp glance of a nearby soldier. The Empress tilted her head slightly, studying him the way someone studies an object they cannot immediately categorize. Every other being in this hall understood what was required of them, she said. "Are you slow to learn, or simply unwilling?" "Unwilling," Daniel said, because it was the truth, and because he had never seen the benefit of pretending otherwise in front of someone who could clearly tell the difference. Something flickered behind her violet eyes. Not anger, though he had expected anger. Something closer to interest. "You wear the uniform of a guard," she said, glancing at the insignia on his shoulder. "A protector of this station. Yet you do not protect yourself with obedience. Even now, even here, in front of soldiers who could end your life before you finished your next sentence." "My oath was to protect people," Daniel said, "not to kneel to whoever holds the most power in the room. Those aren't the same thing." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of an entire hall holding its breath, waiting to see whether a single unarmed man had just signed his own end, or whether he had said something that no one in this Empress's presence had dared say in a very long time. Yathara Sel studied him for a long moment. Then, without warning, the corner of her mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, but close enough to unsettle the soldiers standing near her, who exchanged glances Daniel could not interpret. "What is your name?" she asked. "Daniel Voss." "Daniel Voss," she repeated, testing the shape of it. "You have just told the ruler of the Krizeth Empire, in front of her own soldiers and the people you claim to protect, that your loyalty does not extend to submission." She paused. "Do you understand what that means?" "I understand it might mean my life," Daniel said. "But it also means I told you the truth. I'd rather you know exactly what kind of guard is standing near you than one who bows out of fear and can't be trusted the moment fear isn't enough to hold him." For a moment, nobody moved. The soldiers along the wall seemed to be waiting for a signal that never came. The kneeling crowd remained frozen, hundreds of people afraid to breathe too loudly. Grace's eyes had not left Daniel's back the entire time. Her whole body tensed, as though she might need to move at any second. though she had no idea what she could possibly do if the Empress decided this conversation should end badly. Yathara Cell took a slow step closer to him, close enough now that Daniel could see the fine detail in the embroidery of her robes, the faint shimmer of her skin, catching the overhead light, close enough that he understood, with sudden clarity, just how easily this could end. "In my empire," she said quietly, so that only those nearest could hear, "no one has spoken to me this way in longer than you have been alive." Daniel held her gaze and said nothing. He had learned, long ago, that silence could say more than words when the moment called for it, and something told him this was exactly that kind of moment. She studied him a moment longer, and then, to the visible shock of every soldier in the hall, she turned away from him and addressed the crowd instead. "Rise," she said simply. Hundreds of people lifted their heads in confusion, unsure if they had heard correctly. Slowly, uncertainly, they began to stand, glancing at one another, glancing at Daniel, glancing at the Empress who had just given an order no one expected. Yathara Cell turned back to Daniel one final time, before she moved toward the far end of the hall, her soldiers falling into formation around her once again. "You will be reassigned," she said, "to my personal guard detail, effective immediately." Daniel's stomach tightened. It was not the outcome he expected, and he was certain, watching the flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, that it was not a reward. It was something else, a test, perhaps, or the beginning of one. "With respect," Daniel said carefully, "I didn't ask for that assignment." "No," she agreed, glancing back at him over her shoulder, the faintest trace of that almost smile returning to her face. "You did not, but you are the first person in a very long time who has told me the truth without being asked twice. I find I would like to know if that was courage, Daniel Voss, or simply the beginning of a very short and interesting career." She walked away without waiting for a response, her soldiers closing ranks behind her, leaving Daniel standing alone in the center of the concourse, while the entire station stared at him in stunned silence, uncertain whether they had just watched a man save his own life, or walk willingly into something far more dangerous than anything the Empire's arrival had promised. Grace was the first to reach him once the soldiers had moved far enough away. She grabbed his arm, her voice a fierce whisper. "Are you out of your mind?" "Probably," Daniel admitted, still watching the golden robes disappear through the far doors. "You don't say no to someone like that. You don't correct her. Do you understand what she could have done to you in that hall?" "I understand," Daniel said quietly. "I understood it the whole time I was talking." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment, turning the question over in his mind, searching for an answer that would make sense to someone who had not felt what he felt in that half-second before his knees refused to bend. "Because the moment I kneel to someone out of fear instead of respect," he said finally, "I stop being able to tell the difference between the two. And the day I can't tell the difference anymore is the day I'm not fit to protect anybody." Grace studied him for a long moment, her expression shifting from fear to something closer to reluctant understanding, though worry never fully left her eyes. "Personal guard detail," she said slowly, "to the Empress herself. Do you have any idea what that actually means?" "No," Daniel admitted, glancing toward the doors where Yathara Cell had vanished, the golden light of the hall suddenly feeling colder than it had a few minutes ago. "But I have a feeling I'm about to find out." Outside, beyond the station's reinforced windows, the golden ship sat anchored against the black of open space, patient and silent, like something that had already decided how this story would end, and was simply waiting for Daniel to catch up. Somewhere deep within its glowing corridors, an Empress, who had not been surprised by anyone in longer than she cared to admit, found herself thinking, for the first time in years, that perhaps her latest conquest had brought her something far more valuable than territory. It had brought her a man who refused to kneel, and she intended to find out exactly what that was worth. Daniel's new quarters were 3 decks above where he used to sleep, in a section of the station that had been sealed off and refitted within a single day by machines he never saw arrive. The walls were the same pale gold as the Empress's ship, warm to the touch, humming faintly with a current he could not identify. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, feeling the same unease he had felt watching that golden ship descend from the black. He did not sleep much that first night. Every sound in the unfamiliar corridor outside made him tense. Every shift in the low hum of the station's new systems pulled him half upright before he forced himself back down. By the time morning arrived, or whatever counted as morning on a station now governed by an empire that did not run on human time, he was already awake and dressed, waiting for whatever came next. What came next was a soldier named Corin, tall and silver-skinned like the others, who arrived at his door without knocking, and informed him, in careful but accented standard, that his first duty shift began immediately. "You will accompany the Empress during her inspection of the lower decks," Corin said, his violet eyes unreadable. "You will not speak unless addressed. You will not act unless a threat is confirmed. Is this understood?" "Understood," Daniel said, though something in him already doubted he would follow that instruction perfectly. The lower decks of Vera Station had always been the least glamorous part of the place, a maze of storage bays, maintenance corridors, and cramped worker housing that visiting dignitaries rarely bothered to see. Daniel had expected the Empress to skip this part of her inspection entirely, the way most officials did, content to review reports rather than walk through the mess themselves. He was wrong. Yathara Sel moved through the lower decks with the same unhurried grace she had shown in the grand hall, her robes trailing over graded floors that had never been designed for anything so fine. She stopped often, examining conditions that Daniel suspected she had never been shown by her own advisors, asking questions that revealed she already knew more than she let on. "This water reclamation system," she said, pausing beside a rusted unit that had been patched more times than Daniel could count, "has not been properly maintained in some time." The station engineer accompanying them, a nervous man named Oliver Hart, stumbled through an explanation about budget constraints and supply delays that had existed long before the Kryzeth arrived. Ithara listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she turned not to him, but to Daniel. "You," she said, "you lived in this section, did you not, before your reassignment?" Daniel hesitated, surprised she had known that detail at all. "Not this exact section, 2 decks up. But yes, close enough." "Then tell me honestly," she said, her violet eyes steady on him. "Was this a problem the station administration knew about, or one they hid from anyone who might have fixed it?" Daniel felt the weight of the question, aware that his answer could end Oliver's career, or worse, depending on how Kryzeth Justice handled such things. But he had already decided, back in that golden hall, that honesty was the only currency he intended to deal in here. "They knew," Daniel said. "It's been a problem for over a year. Money kept getting redirected to the docking bay upgrades instead, because that's what visiting trade ships saw first. Nobody wanted to spend on something buried 3 decks down where nobody important would notice." Oliver's face went pale. Yathara's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted, a subtle stillness that Daniel was beginning to recognize as her version of anger. "Fascinating," she said quietly. "An empire arrives to inspect the worth of a station, and its own leadership cannot be bothered to keep its people supplied with clean water, so long as the surface looks acceptable." She turned to Corin. "See that this is repaired within the week, properly. Not patched." "Yes, my Empress." She walked on without another word, leaving Oliver visibly shaking with relief, and Daniel found himself, for the first time since the golden ship arrived, feeling something other than dread about the woman he had been assigned to protect. The inspection continued for hours, moving through cramped living quarters, understaffed medical bays, and finally into the wide cargo hold that served as the station's unofficial gathering space. It was there, among crates and idle workers who had not expected to see their new ruler walking casually through their break area, that the first real test of Daniel's new position arrived. It happened fast, the way these things always did. A worker near the back of the hold, a woman whose name Daniel did not know, suddenly shouted something in a dialect he didn't recognize, and lunged forward, not toward the Empress directly, but toward a maintenance panel beside her, her hands already reaching for something concealed beneath a loose section of grating. Every soldier in the hold reacted at once, weapons raised, the air thick with sudden violet-white light as targeting systems activated. Daniel moved without thinking, closing the distance between himself and the Empress in less than 2 seconds, placing his body between her and the woman while raising a hand toward the soldiers, a gesture that in any human unit would have meant hold your fire. To his own astonishment, they held. "Wait," Daniel said, his voice sharp but controlled, his eyes on the woman rather than the weapon she had exposed. A crude signal jammer clearly meant to disrupt station communications rather than harm anyone directly. "She's not armed for combat." "That's a jammer, not a weapon." The woman froze, staring at the ring of soldiers now surrounding her, her expression shifting from desperate determination to raw terror as the reality of what she had just done settled over her. "I just wanted them to hear us," she said, her voice cracking. "The families in the lower decks. Nobody listens unless the signal reaches the trade routes. I wasn't going to hurt anyone." Daniel glanced back at Yathara Sel, who had not moved, who watched the scene unfold with an expression he could not fully read, somewhere between calculation and genuine curiosity. "Let me handle this," Daniel said quietly, for her ears only. She studied him for a long moment, and then, to the visible confusion of every soldier in the room, she gave a small nod. Daniel stepped forward, lowering himself to the woman's level rather than looming over her, his voice steady and calm, in a way he had learned long ago could diffuse situations. Weapons alone never could. "What's your name?" "Lucy," she said, barely above a whisper. "Lucy Bennett." "Lucy, I need you to put your hands where I can see them. Slowly. Nobody here wants to hurt you, but you scared a room full of people, with a lot of firepower, and that's a dangerous thing to do, even for a good reason." Lucy's hands trembled as she raised them, the jammer clattering to the floor, and Daniel felt the tension in the room ease by a fraction, though the soldiers' weapons remained raised. "Why did you do it?" Daniel asked. "Because nobody up top ever hears us," Lucy said, tears now openly running down her face. "The Empress walks through for one day and then she's gone, and everything goes back to the way it was, and my daughter still gets sick from that water system nobody ever fixes, and I thought if I could just get the message out, if the trade routes heard, someone with real power might actually—" She stopped, seeming to realize, all at once, who was standing several feet behind Daniel, listening to every word. Yathara Sel stepped forward, and Daniel rose slowly to give her room, though he did not move far, positioning himself in a way that kept him between the Empress and any sudden movement without appearing to hover. "Your water system will be repaired within the week," the Empress said, her voice carrying an authority that needed no volume to fill the space. "I gave that order less than an hour ago. You did not need to risk your life to be heard, Lucy Bennett. You simply needed someone willing to carry your voice to the ears that could act on it." She glanced, briefly, at Daniel. "It seems I already have such a person." Lucy stared between them, utterly bewildered, as two soldiers stepped forward to take her into custody, though Yathara raised a hand before they could restrain her too roughly. "She will not be executed," the Empress said, loud enough for the entire hold to hear, loud enough that Daniel understood it was meant as a message to everyone watching, not just the soldiers. "She will be held and questioned, and if her account proves true, she will be released with an apology for the neglect that drove her to such desperation. My empire does not punish desperation. It punishes the conditions that create it." A murmur ran through the crowd of workers, disbelief mixing with something that looked, cautiously, like hope. As the soldiers led Lucy away, Yathara turned to Daniel, studying him with an intensity that made him distinctly aware of how close he had just come to being caught in the crossfire of his own decision. "You disobeyed a direct order," she said quietly, once they were alone enough that only Corin remained within earshot. "I instructed you not to act unless a threat was confirmed." "With respect," Daniel said, "I did confirm it. I confirmed it wasn't the kind of threat that needed a room full of weapons pointed at a scared woman holding a signal jammer." Yathara studied him for a long moment, and Daniel braced himself for whatever consequence might follow, uncertain whether his second act of defiance in as many days would be met with the same strange tolerance as the first. Instead, she said something that surprised him more than any punishment could have. "In one day," she said, "you have told me an uncomfortable truth about my own inspection, and you have stopped my soldiers from making a mistake that would have turned this station against me permanently. Tell me, Daniel Voss, is this simply who you are, or are you always this determined to prove yourself right in front of an Empress?" "It's not about being right," Daniel said. "It's about getting it right. There's a difference." Something that might have been the beginning of respect flickered across her expression, quickly hidden behind the same unreadable stillness she wore like armor. "We will see," she said, "whether that distinction serves you as well in the days ahead as it has today." She turned and walked toward the hold's exit, her soldiers falling into step around her, and Daniel followed a pace behind, uncertain whether he had just earned a strange kind of trust or simply delayed whatever reckoning was still waiting for him. Behind them, the workers of the lower decks watched in stunned silence, already whispering among themselves about the human guard who had spoken back to an Empress and lived, who had stood between his own people and Kruzeth weapons, and somehow made both sides listen. Word of what had happened in the cargo hold spread through Vera Station faster than any official announcement could have traveled. By evening, Daniel could feel the shift in how people looked at him in the corridors, no longer simply as a security contractor they vaguely recognized, but as something else entirely, something they did not yet have a name for. Not quite a hero, not quite a traitor for serving the Empire so closely. Something uncertain, caught between two worlds that had collided far too quickly for anyone to fully understand what they were watching unfold. Grace found him that night in the mess hall, sliding into the seat across from him with the same sharp-eyed expression she always wore when she had something on her mind. "You're becoming a problem," she said without preamble. "For who?" "For everyone," Grace said. "The station administrators don't know what to do with you, because you're not answering to them anymore. The Kruzeth soldiers don't know what to do with you, because you keep breaking protocol, and somehow not dying for it. And the workers down in the lower decks are already telling stories about you like you're something out of a myth." Daniel rubbed a hand over his tired eyes. "I'm not trying to be any of those things." "I know," Grace said, softening slightly. "That's what makes it worse. You're not performing for anyone. You're just being exactly who you've always been, and it turns out that's apparently enough to unsettle an empire." Daniel thought of Yathara Sell's expression in the cargo hold, the flicker of something unreadable when Lucy Bennett's fear had turned, for just a moment, into hope. He thought of the water system that would now be repaired, of the soldiers who had held their fire on his signal, of the strange, careful respect that had passed between himself and a woman who ruled 100 worlds. "I don't think I'm unsettling an empire," he said quietly. "I think I might just be reminding one what it's supposed to look like." Grace studied him for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, she smiled. "Just be careful, Daniel," she said. "Empresses aren't known for staying patient forever. Sooner or later she's going to test you in a way that isn't this easy to walk away from." Daniel did not know, as he sat there in the quiet hum of the mess hall, just how soon that test was coming, or how much would be asked of him before it was over. But somewhere above him, in a chamber of pale gold light, Yathara Sell stood at a viewport looking out over the station she had just claimed, turning over in her mind the strange, unshaken calm of a man who had twice now refused to simply obey, and finding, much to her own surprise, that she did not want him removed from her side. She wanted to know exactly how far his convictions would carry him, and she intended to find out. The summons came 5 days later, delivered not by Corin or any of the usual soldiers, but by a Kruzeth official Daniel had never seen before. A narrow, precise man named Phelan, who wore the deep violet sash of the imperial court, rather than armor. He found Daniel in the training yard the station had hastily converted for the guard detail, sparring with Grace under the watchful eyes of 2 silver-skinned soldiers, who still seemed unsure what to make of human hand-to-hand combat. "The Empress requires you at the outer docking ring," Phelan said, his voice clipped and formal. "There has been an incident involving a delegation from the Marn Collective. Your presence has been specifically requested." Grace lowered her guard, glancing at Daniel with a look that carried more concern than the words themselves seemed to warrant. "Specifically requested, meaning what exactly?" "Meaning," Phelan said, already turning to leave, "that the Empress believes his particular talents may be useful in preventing this situation from becoming a war." Daniel felt the weight of that sentence settle into his chest as he grabbed his jacket and followed the official through the station's corridors, his mind racing through everything he had learned about the political landscape in the days since the Kruzeth arrival. The Marn Collective, he knew only in fragments, was a loose alliance of trading worlds that had resisted Kruzeth expansion for decades, neither fully independent nor fully conquered, existing in a tense, unofficial peace that could apparently shatter at any moment. The outer docking ring was in chaos by the time they arrived. A Marn transport ship sat locked in the station's largest bay, its hull marked with unfamiliar insignia, surrounded by a tense standoff between Kryzeth soldiers and a group of armed Marn representatives, who had clearly not expected to find an Imperial fleet occupying what they had believed was neutral territory. Yathara Sel stood at the center of it, flanked by Korin and 2 other soldiers, her expression carefully neutral, as she addressed a tall, weathered man Daniel assumed was the Marn delegation's leader. "Ambassador Halden," she was saying as Daniel approached, "I understand your concern. But I assure you, the Kryzeth presence on this station is not an act of aggression toward your collective. Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe," Halden said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "You arrive without warning, seize administrative control of a station that has traded freely with our worlds for a generation, and now you tell me this is not aggression." Daniel took his position near the Empress's side, close enough to act if needed, far enough to remain within the boundaries of his role. He studied Halden's posture, the way his hand rested near his belt, the tension radiating through the Marn representatives behind him. This was not a man looking for a fight. This was a man terrified of one, doing everything he could to prevent it, while still standing his ground. "The collective has been offered a trade agreement," Yathara said. "Nothing more. You are free to decline it, Ambassador, but I would ask that you not mistake caution for hostility. And I would ask," Halden shot back, "that you not mistake our caution for weakness. We have seen what happens to worlds that accept your generous offers. We have seen what remains of them a decade later." The tension in the room spiked visibly, soldiers on both sides tightening their grips on weapons that had not yet been raised but clearly could be within seconds. Daniel felt the old, familiar instinct rise in him, the same one that had kept him alive through years of service, the ability to read a room on the edge of violence and find the single thread that might still pull it back from the brink. He stepped forward, deliberately, drawing Yathara's brief glance of surprise as he did so. "Ambassador Halden," Daniel said, keeping his voice level and unhurried. "My name is Daniel Voss. I'm not Kryzeth. I'm human, same as you'd find on any station in this sector, and I've been serving as part of the Empress's personal guard for the past 5 days. Halden's eyes narrowed, studying him with obvious confusion. A human, guarding an Empress who conquers human worlds? That's a fair question, Daniel admitted, and I asked myself something close to it the first day this happened. But I'll tell you what I've seen in 5 days, if you're willing to hear it, because I think it matters more than whatever history is sitting between your collective and this empire." Halden hesitated, then gave a short, wary nod. "5 days ago," Daniel continued, "I watched this station's own administration ignore a water system that was making children sick for over a year, because fixing it wasn't good for appearances. I watched the Empress standing beside me, order it repaired within the hour of finding out. I watched a woman driven to a desperate act by that same neglect get treated with mercy instead of execution, because the Empress decided punishing desperation wasn't the kind of justice she wanted her rule to be known for." He paused, meeting Halden's eyes directly. "I'm not here to tell you the Kryzeth Empire has a clean history. I don't know enough about what happened to the worlds you're talking about to defend or condemn it, but I can tell you what I've witnessed with my own eyes, in the time I've spent close enough to see the truth behind the ceremony. And what I've seen isn't a ruler looking to crush your collective. It's someone testing whether trust can still be built where it's been broken before." The docking ring fell into a heavy, uncertain silence. Halden studied Daniel for a long moment, and then turned his gaze to Yathara Sel, his expression shifting from open hostility to something more cautious, more considering. "Is this true?" he asked her directly. "What he says about the water system, about the woman?" "It is," Yathara said simply. "You may verify it with anyone on this station. I have no reason to lie to you, Ambassador, and every reason to prove to you that I do not need to." Halden's shoulders eased, just slightly, the tension in the room shifting from the edge of violence towards something more manageable, though far from resolved. "I did not come here to fight an empire," he said finally. "I came here to protect my people from becoming another story told in warning to other worlds. If what this human says is true, if there is a version of this arrangement that does not end the way it has ended elsewhere, then I am willing to talk. But I will not kneel to promises alone. I will need to see them kept. Then we are in agreement, Yathara said. I do not ask for blind faith, Ambassador. I ask only for the chance to earn what has not yet been given. The standoff dissolved slowly over the following hour, weapons lowered, soldiers on both sides retreating to a wary but no longer hostile distance, as Yathara and Halden moved into a private chamber to begin what would become the first of many long negotiations between the Empire and the Marn Collective. Daniel remained outside the chamber doors, standing guard in the literal sense for the first time since his reassignment, though his mind stayed fixed on the strange, unfamiliar role he had just stepped into. It was Corin who approached him once the immediate crisis had passed, his violet eyes studying Daniel with something that looked, for the first time, like genuine respect rather than mere tolerance. You may have prevented a conflict today, Corin said quietly, one that would have cost lives on both sides. I just told him the truth, Daniel said, that's all. In my experience, Corin replied, the truth is rarely enough on its own to stop a war already halfway begun. It requires someone the listener believes has nothing to gain by telling it. He paused. You are becoming that person, Daniel Voss. To the Marn Collective, to the workers of this station. Perhaps, in time, to others as well. Daniel considered that, uncertain how he felt about the weight settling onto his shoulders with each passing day. He had come to Vera Station looking for quiet, for distance from the kind of responsibility that had worn him down in his old life. Instead, he seemed to be walking deeper into exactly the kind of role he thought he had left behind, except now the stakes were no longer measured in single lives, but in the fate of entire worlds balanced on the edge of an empire's first real test of restraint. The negotiations with the Marn Collective continued for 3 more days, and Daniel found himself present for most of them, not as a formal participant, but as a quiet, steady presence that both sides seemed to have unconsciously agreed served as a kind of anchor in the room. He said little during the actual discussions, understanding that his role was not to negotiate but to witness, to be the visible proof that promises made in that chamber were not simply words meant to placate a wary ally into compliance. It was during the final day of negotiations that the true test arrived, though not in the form anyone expected. Daniel was standing near the chamber's entrance when Grace found him, her expression tight with an urgency that immediately set him on edge. We have a problem, she said, pulling him aside. One of the Kryzeth engineering teams found something in the station's lower systems, a device, hidden in the maintenance tunnels near the water reclamation unit that was just repaired. What kind of device? They're not sure yet. But it's not station equipment, and it wasn't there before the repairs began. Someone planted it during the work, and given the location, it's close enough to the negotiation chamber that if it's what they think it might be, it could take out this entire section of the station. Daniel felt his stomach drop. Does the Empress know? Not yet. She's still in session with Halden. Corin wants to evacuate the area quietly before telling her. Avoid causing a panic that could look like the negotiations themselves are under threat. That's a mistake, Daniel said immediately. If this is an attack aimed at derailing the peace talks, she needs to know now, not after we've already tried to handle it without her. He moved quickly toward the chamber, ignoring Grace's protest, and entered without waiting for permission, drawing startled looks from both Yathara and Halden mid-conversation. Forgive the interruption, Daniel said, but there's a situation that affects both of you directly, and I think you both deserve to hear it at the same time. He explained quickly, watching the color drain from Halden's face as the implications settled in, watching Yathara's expression harden into the same careful stillness he had seen in the Grand Hall on his first day. You believe this is sabotage, Yathara said, meant to make it appear the Marn Collective attacked me during negotiations. Or meant to make it look like your own people attacked the ambassador, Daniel said. Either way, it's designed to blow apart everything you've spent 3 days building. Whoever planted it wants this piece to fail, and wants both sides to blame each other for why. Halden rose sharply from his seat. I had no part in this. You must believe that. I do, Yathara said, surprising Daniel with the immediacy of her answer. This is not the work of the Marn Collective. This is the work of someone within my own court, who does not wish to see this alliance succeed. The accusation hung heavy in the room, and Daniel understood, in that moment, just how deep the danger truly ran. This was not simply a threat to be neutralized. It was proof that the greatest danger to everything Yathara Cell was trying to build did not come from outside her empire, but from within it. "We need to clear this section immediately," Daniel said, quietly, without triggering whoever planted it to detonate early. "I can get Ambassador Halden and his delegation to a secure location. Corrin's team can handle the device itself, but the Empress needs to be seen leaving calmly, not fleeing in panic, or this whole thing still succeeds in making it look like the talks collapsed under pressure." Yathara studied him for a long moment, then gave a single, sharp nod. "Do it." What followed was the tensest hour of Daniel's time on Vera Station, guiding Halden and his shaken delegation through service corridors while Kryzeth engineering teams worked in careful silence to disarm a device that, once examined closely, turned out to be far more sophisticated than anything a lone saboteur should have had access to. It bore markings, Corrin reported grimly, consistent with technology reserved for the Empire's own military engineers. By the time the device was safely disarmed, and the section declared secure, the full weight of what had happened settled over everyone involved. This had not been an external attack. It had been an attempt, orchestrated by someone with access to the highest levels of Kryzeth technology, to destroy the fragile peace being built in that chamber, and to do it in a way that would have plunged the Empire and the Marn Collective back into open hostility. Yathara Cell stood in the now empty negotiation chamber that evening, staring at the space where the device had been found, her expression unreadable in the low golden light. "Someone in my own court tried to have me killed today," she said quietly, when Daniel entered to report the section fully secured. "Or worse, tried to make it appear the ambassador I was trying to build trust with had done it instead." "You don't seem surprised," Daniel observed. "I am not," she said. "There are those in my court who believe strength is measured only by conquest, who see every negotiation, every mercy, every attempt to build something that does not require domination, as weakness that will eventually collapse the empire from within. I have suspected such people existed for some time. Today confirmed it." She turned to face him fully, her violet eyes carrying an intensity Daniel had not seen from her before, something raw beneath the careful composure she wore, like a second set of armor. "You saved this alliance today," she said. "Perhaps you saved my life as well, though I suspect the device was never meant to kill me directly, only to make certain I would have reason to blame the very people I was trying to trust." "I just did what needed doing," Daniel said. "Same as always." "No," Yathara said, shaking her head slowly. "What you did today was recognize danger before anyone else in this station, including my own soldiers, understood its shape. You saw not just the device, but the intention behind it, the deeper game being played beneath the surface. That is not simply loyalty, Daniel Voss. That is something far rarer." She studied him for a long moment, and Daniel felt, for the first time since arriving on this station, that the strange, cautious distance between them had shifted into something else entirely, something neither of them had a clear name for yet. "I have decided," she said finally, "to trust you with something few outside my innermost circle are permitted to know. There are factions within my own nobility who will not accept a human standing this close to my throne, no matter what he has proven himself capable of. What happened today was only the beginning of what they are willing to attempt to remove you, and by extension, to remove the influence you represent." "Then I imagine things are about to get more complicated," Daniel said. A faint, tired smile crossed her face, the first genuine one he had seen from her since the golden ship first descended upon Vera Station. "Complicated," she repeated. "Yes, I imagine they are." Outside the chamber, beyond the reinforced windows, the stars remained fixed and distant, indifferent to the storm quietly gathering within the Empire's own court. A storm that Daniel Voss, once a man who only wanted quiet and distance, now found himself standing directly in the center of, whether he had asked for that position or not. News of the sabotage attempt could not be contained forever, and within a week, whispers of it had reached every level of Kryzeth society connected to Vera Station, twisted and reshaped with each retelling, until the story bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually happened. By the time it reached the ears of the Imperial Court itself, the tale had transformed into something far more dangerous than a simple assassination attempt. It had become a referendum on the Empress's judgment, and specifically, on her decision to keep a human at her side. Daniel felt the shift in atmosphere the moment the first delegation of Kryzeth nobles arrived on the station, summoned by Ithara herself to address the growing unrest within her own ranks. They moved through the golden corridors with none of the caution Haldan's people had shown, none of the wary respect that had slowly developed between the station's workers and their new rulers. These were nobles born into power, accustomed to a version of the empire that had never once been questioned from within, and their eyes, when they landed on Daniel standing at the Empress's side, carried open contempt. "This is what has become of the throne," one of them, a sharp-featured woman named Vesa Kalarin, said during the first formal session in the station's converted council chamber. "A human, standing where only the Empire's most trusted guards have ever been permitted to stand. Tell me, Ithara, has conquest become so tiresome that you now seek entertainment instead of strength?" The chamber, filled with perhaps 30 nobles and their attendants, went silent at the open challenge. Daniel remained still beside the Empress's chair, his expression carefully neutral, though he felt every eye in the room measuring him, weighing him, deciding in advance what conclusions to draw. "Lady Kaloran," Ithara said, her voice calm, but carrying an edge Daniel had learned to recognize as genuine warning. "You forget yourself." "I forget nothing," Vesa replied. "I remember every world this empire has claimed through strength alone. I remember that our ancestors did not build what we have by seeking approval from those they conquered, and now you tell us that a man from one of those conquered worlds saved your life, and you reward him not with dismissal, but with a place at your side that even our own bloodlines must earn through generations of service." "He did not simply save my life," Ithara said. "He prevented a war. He recognized a threat that came not from the Marn Collective, not from any outside enemy, but from within this very court, planted by someone with access to imperial engineering resources that only a noble house could provide." The accusation landed heavily across the chamber, and Daniel watched as several of the assembled nobles exchanged quick, uneasy glances, though none spoke. "You accuse one of us," Vesa said slowly, "of attempting to sabotage your negotiations." "I accuse someone within this court," Ithara said. "I have not yet determined who." "But I promise you, Lady Kaloran, that I will." The session ended without resolution, the nobles retreating into private conversations that Daniel was not permitted to overhear, though he could read enough in their expressions to understand that the Empire's court had fractured into something far more dangerous than open disagreement. There were factions now, quietly forming, some standing behind Ithara's vision of an empire that could hold power through trust rather than fear alone, others gathering around Vesa Kaloran's conviction that any deviation from pure conquest was a weakness that would eventually unravel everything the Kryzeth had built. Grace found Daniel later that evening in the training yard, where he had retreated to work through the tension of the day, with nothing but a sparring dummy and his own frustration. "You look like a man who's about to be blamed for starting a civil war," she said, leaning against the doorway. "I might be," Daniel admitted, pausing his strikes to catch his breath. "There's a whole faction of the nobility that thinks I'm proof the Empress has gone soft, and there's another faction that's starting to see me as some kind of symbol for a different way of doing things, which honestly might be worse, because now I'm not just a target, I'm a talking point." "Do you regret it?" Grace asked. "Any of it? Not kneeling? All of this?" Daniel considered the question seriously before answering. "No," he said finally, "but I'd be lying if I said I expected it to turn into this. I thought I was just refusing to bow to fear. I didn't think it would end up shaping the direction of an entire empire's politics. That's the thing about doing the right thing in front of the right people," Grace said. "Sometimes it doesn't stay small. Sometimes it becomes bigger than you ever wanted it to be." Over the following days, the danger surrounding Daniel grew more concrete, no longer confined to sharp words exchanged in council chambers. Corin approached him quietly one morning, his expression grave in a way Daniel had not seen from the soldier before. "There has been chatter," Corin said, "among certain members of Lady Kaloran's household staff, discussing methods of removing you that would not directly implicate the Empress in a decision to dismiss you herself. An accident, perhaps. Something that could not be traced back to any single hand. You're telling me someone's planning to have me killed." "I am telling you," Corin said, "that you should trust no meal you have not watched prepared, no corridor you have not walked before, and no soldier you do not recognize by name. I have arranged for 2 of my own people to remain near you at all times, but I cannot promise this will be enough if Lady Caloran's faction grows desperate enough. Daniel absorbed this information with a strange, distant calm, the kind that had carried him through every dangerous assignment of his old military life. He had faced death before. He had simply never expected to face it as a political symbol, in a war of ideas, within an alien empire he had never asked to become part of. Does the Empress know about this threat? She knows, Corin said. She has not told you herself, because she does not wish to add fear to whatever choice you make next. What choice? Corin hesitated, then spoke carefully, as though weighing exactly how much he was permitted to reveal. Lady Caloran has demanded a formal convocation, a full gathering of the Imperial Court, to settle the matter of your position once and for all. She intends to force the Empress to choose publicly, in front of every noble house, between upholding tradition by removing you, or defending you, and risking the loyalty of a significant portion of her own nobility. Daniel felt the weight of that settle over him. When? 3 days from now. The 3 days that followed felt to Daniel like walking through a station he no longer fully recognized, every corridor now carrying the weight of unseen tension, every glance from a passing noble or soldier, laden with calculations he could not read. He spent long hours in quiet conversation with Yathara, not about politics or strategy, but about smaller things, the Empire's history, the reasons behind her belief that conquest without trust could never truly hold, the weight she carried as a ruler who had inherited a throne, built on centuries of pure dominance, and was now trying, carefully and at great personal risk, to shift its foundation toward something more sustainable. They do not understand, she told him one evening, standing at the same viewport where he had first seen her looking out over the station, that trust is not the opposite of strength. It is simply a different kind of strength, one that outlasts fear, because it does not require constant renewal through violence. Not everyone's going to see it that way, Daniel said. Some people only understand power as something you take by force. Trying to explain a different kind of power to them is like trying to describe color to someone who's only ever seen in shades of gray. Then perhaps, Yathara said quietly, they need to be shown, rather than told. On the evening before the convocation, Daniel found himself unable to sleep, walking the quiet corridors of the station's upper decks alone, save for the 2 silent guards Corin had assigned to shadow him at a respectful distance. He passed through the section that had once been the lower deck's cargo hold, now quieter at this hour, and found himself thinking of Lucy Bennett, of the fear in her eyes before Yathara's mercy had transformed it into something like hope, of the strange, unlikely thread connecting a desperate woman with a signal jammer to an empress, now facing the greatest political crisis of her reign. He thought, too, of his own choice in that grand hall weeks ago, the half-second of frozen disbelief that had somehow reshaped the course of an empire's internal politics. He had not set out to become a symbol. He had simply refused to bow to something he did not believe deserved his submission, yet here he was, at the center of a storm that could determine whether an empire's oldest traditions held firm, or whether something new, something uncertain but perhaps more just, might have room to grow in their place. He found Yathara awake as well, standing alone in the negotiation chamber where the sabotage device had been discovered weeks earlier, now fully repaired and gleaming under the low golden light. You should be resting, she said without turning, somehow aware of his presence before he had made a sound. So should you, Daniel replied, stepping further into the room. She turned to face him, and for the first time since he had known her, he saw something in her expression that looked distinctly like uncertainty, quickly masked, but not entirely hidden. Tomorrow, she said, Lady Caloran will demand I choose between you and the loyalty of a significant portion of my own court. Whatever I decide will define the shape of my reign for years to come, perhaps for the rest of it. What do you want to do? Daniel asked. It is not simply a matter of what I want, she said. It is a matter of what this empire can survive. If I remove you to placate Caloran's faction, I confirm every belief they hold, that trust is weakness, that mercy is only ever temporary, that in the end, tradition and force will always win. But if I defend you publicly, I risk fracturing my court entirely, risking rebellion from houses that have stood beside my family for generations." Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering his next words carefully. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "I never asked you to choose between me and your empire. If tomorrow goes badly, if you decide the only way to hold things together is to send me away, I'll understand. I came here without wanting any of this. I won't blame you for ending it the same way." Yathara studied him for a long, searching moment, something shifting behind her violet eyes that Daniel could not fully interpret. "That," she said quietly, "is precisely why I do not intend to send you away. Because I said I'd accept it if you did? Because you have never once, in all the weeks you have stood beside me, asked for anything for yourself," she said. "Not position, not protection, not favor. Every choice you have made has been in service of something larger than your own survival. Lady Kaloran believes strength means never yielding, never showing mercy, never trusting anything that has not been forced into submission. But watching you, Daniel Voss, I have come to understand something my own upbringing never taught me. That the strongest loyalty is not the kind commanded through fear. It is the kind freely given, without demand, without threat, simply because it is deserved." Daniel felt something shift in his chest at her words, something he did not have a name for yet, though he suspected it had been building quietly since that first frozen half-second in the Grand Hall weeks ago. "Tomorrow will not be easy," Yathara said. "Lady Kaloran will not simply accept defeat. She will push, publicly, for either my authority or my judgment to be broken in front of the entire court. I do not yet know exactly how this will unfold." "Then we'll figure it out together," Daniel said. "Same as everything else since I got dragged into this." A faint smile touched her lips, tired but genuine. "Together," she repeated, as though testing the shape of the word. "Yes, I believe that is precisely what tomorrow will require." Outside the chamber, the station moved through its quiet night cycle, unaware that within a matter of hours, the fate of an empire's future, and the life of the one human who had refused to kneel before its throne, would be decided in front of every noble house that had ever sworn loyalty to the Chrysath crown. The Grand Hall had been transformed overnight into something Daniel barely recognized. Where once a few hundred station workers had knelt before an arriving Empress, now the space overflowed with the full weight of Chrysath nobility. Dozens of noble houses, represented by their most senior members, each dressed in ceremonial colors that marked bloodlines stretching back centuries. The air itself felt heavier, charged with the kind of tension that came before a storm no one could yet see but everyone could feel building on the horizon. Daniel stood near the base of the raised platform where Yathara Sel would soon take her place, dressed in the same uniform he had worn every day since his reassignment, deliberately unchanged, deliberately unadorned by any symbol of the strange status he had accumulated over the past weeks. He had considered, briefly, whether he should dress differently for this occasion, whether some gesture toward Chrysath formality might ease the tension in the room. He had decided against it. If this convocation was going to decide his fate, it would decide it based on who he actually was, not on any attempt to appear more palatable to a court that had already made up its mind about him before he ever spoke a word. Grace stood near the hall's entrance among the station's assembled department heads, invited as witnesses to a decision that would shape the future of their world regardless of how it concluded. Her eyes found Daniel's across the crowded room, and she gave him a small, steady nod, the kind of silent support that needed no further words. The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Yathara Sel entered, moving with the same unhurried grace she had carried since the day her ship first descended upon the station, though Daniel could see, in the set of her shoulders, the weight of what this gathering represented. She ascended the platform and took her seat upon the throne that had been constructed specifically for this visit, and the entire hall, noble and commoner alike, dropped into a bow that Daniel, once again, did not join. This time, no one seemed surprised by his refusal. Word had spread far enough that his standing posture had become, in the eyes of the court, simply another fact about the man at the center of their controversy, rather than a fresh provocation. "Rise," Yathara said, and the hall obeyed. Lady Vesa Kaloran did not wait for formal proceedings to begin before stepping forward from among the assembled nobles, her expression carrying the confident edge of someone who believed she had already won whatever argument was about to unfold. My Empress, she said, her voice carrying easily across the silent hall. I thank you for granting this convocation. The matter before us is simple, though its implications are not. For weeks, a human has stood at your side, in a position of trust, traditionally reserved for those who have earned it, through generations of proven loyalty to the Chrysath crown. He does not kneel. He speaks when he wishes, regardless of protocol. He has, by his own admission, disobeyed direct orders from your own soldiers. And now, we are told, someone within our own court attempted sabotage against your negotiations with the Marn Collective, an act this human happened to be present to prevent. She paused, letting the implications settle over the room before continuing. Is it not possible that this entire sequence of events, from his initial refusal to kneel, to his convenient discovery of the sabotage device, has been orchestrated to elevate his position within your court, to place a human of unknown loyalty closer to imperial power than any conquered subject in the history of our empire? A murmur rippled through the assembled nobles, some nodding in agreement, others glancing toward Daniel with fresh suspicion. Daniel felt the accusation land like a physical blow, not because it frightened him, but because of how carefully constructed it was, twisting genuine events into something that painted him not as a man who had simply refused to be dishonest, but as a calculating architect of his own rise to power. That is a serious accusation, Lady Caloran, Yathara said, her voice calm, despite the weight of what had just been suggested. Do you have evidence to support it? I have logic, Vesa said. I have the improbability of a single human, happening to be present for every moment of crisis this station has faced since your arrival. Always positioned to be seen as the hero. Always positioned to gain more trust, more access, more influence. Daniel felt every eye in the hall shift toward him, waiting to see how he would respond, or whether he would be permitted to respond at all. He glanced toward Yathara, who gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod, granting him the space to speak. Lady Caloran, Daniel said, stepping forward, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, despite the effort it took to keep it steady. I understand why my presence here troubles you. I'd probably be suspicious too, if I were in your position, watching someone from outside your world suddenly standing this close to your ruler. But I'd ask you to consider something simple. If I had orchestrated any of this, if I had planned my refusal to kneel as some calculated first step toward influence, wouldn't it have made far more sense to bow that day, to disappear quietly into the crowd, and to work my way toward trust through patience and subtlety, rather than through a single act that could have gotten me executed on the spot? He paused, letting the question settle. I didn't calculate anything that day. I froze, because I couldn't make myself bow to fear instead of respect, and once I was standing there, the only thing left to do was tell the truth about why. Everything that's happened since then has followed the same simple rule. I tell the truth, even when it's inconvenient, even when it puts me at risk, because the moment I stop doing that, I'm not fit to protect anyone, including the Empress standing behind me right now. Convenient words, Vesa said, though something in her certainty had shifted, however slightly. But words alone do not prove intention. No, Daniel agreed. They don't. So let me offer something better than words. He turned, deliberately, to face the assembled court, rather than Vesa alone. 3 weeks ago, I told the truth about a water system this station's own administration let rot for over a year because fixing it wasn't good for appearances. That truth cost a station engineer his comfortable silence and forced a repair that saved people from getting sick. I didn't gain anything from that beyond making an enemy of anyone who preferred the old system of looking the other way. He continued, his voice steady, methodical, laying out each moment not as triumph, but as simple fact. I stood between your soldiers and a frightened, desperate woman, holding nothing more dangerous than a signal jammer, because I could see what your weapons couldn't, that she wasn't a threat, just someone who'd run out of options. That decision could have gotten me court-martialed by your own command structure if the Empress had decided my judgment was worthless. It wasn't calculated to gain favor. It was calculated to keep an innocent person alive. He turned back to Vesa Caloran directly. And when I found evidence of sabotage aimed at destroying peace talks with the Marn Collective, I didn't quietly report it through channels that could have been buried by whoever planted that device in the first place. I brought it straight to the Empress and the ambassador at the same time, in the same room, so that no one, including members of your own court, could twist the truth of what happened after the fact. He let the silence stretch for a moment, before delivering his final point. If I wanted power, Lady Calorin, I chose the single least efficient path toward it. I made enemies at every turn instead of allies. I told inconvenient truths instead of comfortable lies. The only thing I have consistently done, since the day your empire's ship first appeared over this station, is refuse to let fear decide what I say or do. If that's somehow a strategy for climbing toward influence, it's the strangest and most difficult one I can imagine anyone choosing on purpose. The hall remained silent, the weight of his words settling over nobles who had come prepared to see him dismissed as either a threat or a curiosity, and who now found themselves confronted with something harder to categorize. Vesa Calorin's composure had not fully broken, but something in her certainty had visibly cracked. Even if your intentions have been sincere, she said, her voice slightly less confident than before, sincerity does not change the fact that tradition exists for a reason. Our empire was not built by trusting outsiders. It was built by strength, by conquest, by demanding submission, and holding it through unwavering force. If we begin making exceptions for individuals who happen to prove themselves useful, what remains of the principles that have held this empire together for centuries? It was Yathara who answered, rising slowly from her throne, her presence commanding the hall's full attention without need for volume. You speak of strength, Lady Calorin, as though it can only be measured in submission forced through fear, she said. But I ask you to consider what nearly happened 3 weeks ago, in a chamber not far from this very hall. A device, built with imperial engineering resources, planted by someone within our own court, designed to destroy a fragile peace, and plunge us back into open conflict with the Marn Collective. That threat did not come from an outsider refusing to kneel. It came from within these very walls, from someone who believed, as you seem to believe, that any deviation from pure conquest represents an unforgivable weakness. She descended the steps of the platform slowly, moving until she stood directly beside Daniel, close enough that the entire hall could see them as a single unit, rather than ruler and subject standing apart. This man did not save my life that day out of calculation, she continued. He saved it, and the fragile trust I was attempting to build with an ally who had every reason to distrust us, because he understood something this court has forgotten, in its centuries of unquestioned dominance. Loyalty commanded through fear lasts only as long as the fear itself. It requires constant renewal through violence, through submission, through the endless performance of power that must never once be allowed to waver, lest it collapse entirely. But loyalty given freely, without demand, without threat, endures long after the fear that first inspired obedience would have faded. She turned to face the assembled nobles directly, her violet eyes carrying an intensity that silenced even the faintest murmur remaining in the hall. I did not ask this man to kneel that day, because I came, over the following weeks, to understand that his refusal was never disrespect toward my throne. It was proof of exactly the kind of loyalty this empire has never truly possessed, the kind that cannot be commanded, only earned. Every noble house in this hall kneels before me, because tradition and consequence demand it. This man stands beside me because he has chosen, again and again, at real risk to himself, to protect what he believes deserves protecting, without ever once being forced to do so. She paused, letting her gaze move slowly across the gathered court, meeting the eyes of noble after noble who had come to this convocation, certain of their position, and now found themselves reconsidering everything they thought they understood. Lady Calorin asks what remains of our principles if we make exceptions for those who prove themselves worthy of trust, Yathara said. I ask instead what our principles have truly been worth, if they have never once been tested by anyone brave enough to refuse blind submission and offer something more difficult and more valuable in its place. The hall remained utterly silent, the weight of her words settling over centuries of tradition that had never once been challenged so directly, so publicly, by the very ruler sworn to uphold them. Vesa Calorin stood motionless for a long moment, her expression caught between the pride that had carried her into this convocation and the undeniable truth of what she had just witnessed. An empress, defending not simply a controversial decision, but an entirely different vision of what her empire's strength could mean. "You risk everything," Vesa said finally, though the fire had gone out of her earlier certainty, replaced by something more thoughtful, more uncertain. "If this vision of yours fails, if trust proves as fragile as the traditions you seek to move beyond, the consequences will not fall only on you. They will fall on every world under Kryzeth rule." "I understand the risk," Ithara said. "I have understood it since the moment I chose not to remove him after his first refusal to kneel. But I would rather risk building something that might fail than continue perfecting a system that has already begun to rot from within, as today's threat against my own life has proven all too clearly." She turned to address the entire hall once more, her voice carrying the unshakable authority of someone who had made her decision and would not be moved from it. "Daniel Voss remains at my side," she said. "Not as an exception to tradition, but as the beginning of something I intend to build deliberately, a court where loyalty is earned rather than simply demanded, where strength includes the courage to trust as well as the power to conquer. Any noble house that cannot accept this vision is free to voice their objection through proper channels, but I will not remove a man who has proven, time and again, that his loyalty to what is right exceeds any loyalty to comfort or self-preservation." She glanced toward Daniel, and for a moment, the formal weight of the hall seemed to fall away entirely, replaced by something quieter, more personal, passing silently between them.
"He did not ask to be here,"
she said, her voice softer now, though it still carried clearly across the silent chamber. "He did not ask for any of this. He simply refused, on his very first day among us, to let fear decide his actions, and in doing so, he showed me something this empire has needed to see for a very long time. That true strength was never about how many are forced to kneel before you. It is about how many choose, freely, to stand beside you when it matters most." The hall remained silent for a long, suspended moment, until, slowly, one by one, several of the nobles who had come prepared to support Vesa Kaloran's position began to lower their heads, not in the forced bow of submission, but in something closer to quiet acknowledgement, a recognition that they had witnessed something today that could not be easily dismissed or forgotten. Vesa Kaloran herself remained standing, her expression unreadable, but the fight had gone out of her posture entirely. "I will not pretend to agree with everything you have said today," she said finally, "but I will not stand against a decision the court itself has clearly witnessed with open eyes. Do as you believe is right, my Empress. History will judge whether your trust in this man, and in the vision he represents, was wisdom or folly. Then let history judge," Ithara said. "I would rather be remembered for the risk of trying to build something better than for the safety of never once questioning what came before." The convocation dissolved slowly after that, nobles retreating into quiet conversations that carried a different tone than the tense whispers of before, some clearly still troubled, others visibly reconsidering long-held assumptions about the nature of power and loyalty within their empire. Daniel remained standing near the platform long after the hall had begun to empty, the weight of everything that had just happened settling over him slowly, the realization that he had somehow, through nothing more than refusing to kneel on a single ordinary day, become part of reshaping the future of an entire empire's understanding of what strength could mean. Ithara Sel descended the platform once more and stood beside him, watching the last of the nobles file out through the golden doors. "That could have gone very differently," Daniel said quietly. "It could have," she agreed, "but it did not, because you gave this court something they had never once been offered before, proof that loyalty without submission was not only possible, but stronger than anything fear alone could produce." Daniel considered her words, thinking back to that first frozen half-second in the Grand Hall, weeks ago, when he had simply refused to let his knees bend to something he did not believe deserved his fear. "I never set out to change anything," he said. "I just didn't want to be someone who kneels because he's scared not to." "I know," Ithara said, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips, for perhaps only the second time since he had known her. "That is precisely why it worked." Outside the Grand Hall's reinforced windows, The stars remained as distant and unchanged as they had been the day the golden ship first descended upon Vera Station, indifferent to the quiet revolution that had just taken place within its walls. But within the station itself, and within the vast reach of an empire that had, for the first time in centuries, been asked to imagine strength as something other than fear, something had shifted permanently, carried forward not by conquest, but by the simple, unshaken refusal of one human guard to kneel to anything he did not believe deserved his respect. And as Daniel Voss walked beside the Empress who had chosen, against every tradition of her throne, to stand with him rather than send him away, he understood, with quiet certainty, that whatever came next, whatever dangers or challenges the future still held, he would face them the same way he always had, standing upright and telling the truth, no matter the cost.